warm welcome to all of you that have registered for this training session. My name is Ann-Kerstin Myleus, and I'm the Deputy Head of Unit of the Competence Center on Administrative Capacity Building. And my unit is then guilty of coordinating work related to the roadmaps on administrative capacity building. And we have, for example, also been working closely with the OECD and the 5 pilot managing authorities on a specific pilot action on developing roadmaps. And I am very happy to note that we have at least had registrations for this session from 18 different member states. And this shows that there is a genuine interest in this new possibility which has been introduced for the next programming period. And I will tell you a little bit about the background, why we set up this training, and also why we have developed this concept of roadmaps for administrative capacity building. Well, as you can see on this slide, the underlying aim is to actually encourage member states to take on a more strategic approach to use of technical assistance and to capacity building in general. So this is the underlying aim. And you have perhaps also noted that in the regulations for the next programming period, there are additional provisions related to capacity building as compared to previously. And when it comes to the roadmaps, there is no reference to roadmaps for administrative capacity building in the actual articles of the new regulation. I'm talking about the Common Provisions Regulation. However, there is a reference to roadmaps in one of the recitals. And as there is no explanation of what a roadmap is and what it could look like, we decided that we needed to somehow operationalize this new concept, and in order to test this new and to test this new approach. So this is why we launched a pilot action that we carried out in close cooperation with the OECD. And OECD supported 5 pilot managing authorities to develop such roadmaps. And the aim was to actually learn from this process and to sort of develop an example of an approach to take on this. And another background factor, which is also very important, is that in the European semester country report for 2019, there is a specific Annex D to these country reports. And in this Annex D, the Commission has specified its the investment priorities, or that and that the Commission recommends for the member states for the 2021-2027 programming period. And one important part of these investment priorities is also a specific section on factors for effective delivery of cohesion policy. And here certain challenges have been identified for each member state, challenges that member states should address and which are linked to administrative capacity building. And as a matter of fact, a large number of member states were also recommended to develop roadmaps in Annex D. So this is an important background factor, this country reports. And also, we have also commissioned a study on the use of technical assistance for administrative capacity building in 2014-2020. So we looked at the previous programming period. And there are also a number of recommendations from this study that we are also referring to. So if I can have the next slide, please. Yes, and in Annex D, in the 2019 country reports, 10 member states were recommended to develop administrative capacity building roadmaps. And 4 of the member states that were part of the pilot action were also recommended to take into account or build on the experiences of the pilot for the new programming period. And also Italy is a specific case because they already have a long experience of developing so-called plans for strengthening administrative capacity for each region. And so this is also strategic documents on how to improve efficiency of implementation of the funds. So Italy already has this experience and they were recommended to continue with this. However, we have also stated that in addition to these member states that have been specifically mentioned in Annex D, we believe that development of administrative capacity building should be encouraged as good practice in all other member states as well, because this is really a way of actually planning and a way to use, for example, technical assistance in a more strategic way. So we strongly encourage this, and we are also aware of the fact that at least one member state has already started to develop roadmaps, even if they haven't been recommended to do so. And when it comes to these roadmaps that member states have been recommended to develop, and I would like to also just to mention briefly that in Annex D, the challenges that have been identified for each member state, they tend in most, if not all cases, to be of horizontal nature. So, for example, issues related to better public performance, public procurement performance, or it could be issues to address, for example, in relation to prevention of fraud and corruption. These are examples of two horizontal actions. And there are others as well. For example, increased support to beneficiaries is also often mentioned in Annex D. And as these are of more horizontal nature, they may be best addressed in national roadmaps. Because many of these actions are best tackled at national level. However, it is also possible to develop roadmaps at program level, and this is what happened in the pilot that you will hear about. So the roadmaps developed within the framework of the pilot, they were program specific because they addressed challenges that had been identified at the program level. So they were specific for each of the 5 pilot programs. If I can have the next slide, please, Marco. And a few words also about the study on technical assistance, which I referred to. 2 important recommendations coming out from this study was that the member states were actually encouraged to develop administrative capacity building roadmaps. So this was a strong recommendation in general, not only for specific member states, but in general. And also what they also pushed for very much in the conclusions was that it's important to also think about the capacity of the entire ecosystem involved in the management and implementation of the funds. So capacity building is not only for the administrations managing the funds, but also for beneficiaries, partners, etc. So the whole ecosystem should be taken into consideration. And next slide, please. And last but not least, I would like to also refer to the very important experiences from the pilot action. You will hear a lot about this during these 2 days, but I would like to mention some concrete outputs of the pilot action. First of all, the OECD, they developed a synthesis report on phase 1. And you have a link where you can get access to it. It's a very rich document and which I'm sure can provide a lot of inspiration and food for thought. And on the basis of this synthesis report, we have also developed a fact sheet on the pilot. And this fact sheet includes the key takeaways and recommendations to member states and to managing authorities and to the Commission. So this is a 4-page fact sheet summarizing these recommendations. And we have translated it so it's available in 22 languages. And finally, we also have developed a practical toolkit that explains how one can go about when developing a roadmap. So it's a step-by-step approach which is described in this toolkit. And today's training is then also based on this practical toolkit. So we hope that this could also be a useful reference document that you can use in parallel to today's training. And this toolkit we have made available in 14 different languages. And if I can have the final slide as well. And here also a slide about different ways in which you can actually benefit from the experiences of the pilot, and different ways on how you can actually exchange with peers in other member states on the development of roadmaps or implementation of roadmaps. The first point is, of course, today's training. We have planned for 2 sessions now before summer. And we understand that there is high demand, so we will have to consider whether we will also organize a 3rd training session. However, this has not been decided yet. But we saw that this, the registrations for this session, they were, I mean, all the places were filled up very quickly. So we had to actually ask some people to register for the May session. And then I would also like to remind you about our exchange tool, the TAIEX Regio peer-to-peer tool. And this can help you to actually exchange bilaterally with other member states in the form of expert visits, study visits, or multi-country workshops. However, this might be a bit challenging now since we are still in the pandemic. So that is why also exchanges can be organized virtually. So it is also possible to have webinars, virtual exchanges. And so of course we then hope that the physical exchanges can also start to take place later on. And finally, I would also like to mention to you the so-called Regio communities of practitioners. You have been already approached on this. You have received an email and an invitation to express interest for this. However, I understand that it might be difficult to express interest for something if you don't have enough information about this. And this is why a colleague will come and explain this to you at around 3:15, if I understand it correctly. And he will explain a bit more what this is about. But in short, it's sort of a network opportunity for you to exchange with colleagues in other member states in different ways. It can be virtually, physically, bilaterally, or multilaterally on, for example, the development of roadmaps, or later on implementation of roadmaps. So this is something, we have a number of communities that are up and running on different topics, for example, on state aid. We have several on state aid. And we have very positive feedback from those who participate in these communities. And we really hope that there will be interest in this new one, which we plan to set up on roadmaps. And yeah, but you will hear more about it later on today. And I do hope that you will find this training useful, and that it will reply to some of the questions you may have, and might raise new questions as well, and we will be happy to answer those. And I think you will have an excellent team of speakers. You will listen to key people from the OECD that have been involved in running this pilot, and also have also contributed to the toolkit. And we also have 2 very experienced members from 2 of the pilot managing authorities who actually have practical experience on developing and implementing roadmaps. And I think they are excellent ambassadors for this new approach. And I do believe and I do hope that you will find their presentations very useful. So with this, I would like to conclude my introduction, and I would like to wish you a good day, and we will touch base then later towards the end of the day, and I wish you a good and fruitful afternoon. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And Kerstin, before you leave, can we maybe, because we are in a special timing of the negotiation of the regulations, which are not approved, that will be maybe in June. Member states are preparing their programs. I suppose you are not expecting the roadmaps at the presentation of the programs or later on. So what is the preferred approach? I understand that member states are free to choose one or the other to this one. Can you clarify this?
Yes, there are no rules about this, but the roadmaps are formally not part of the program package. However, nothing excludes it from being maybe possibly annexed to a partnership agreement, for example, if it's a national roadmap, or if but it can also be developed in parallel and be kept as a completely parallel document. However, we would like to see reference to any administrative capacity building toolkits in the partnership agreement, where because there is also space to explain this, whether roadmaps are being developed, and also in the specific program documents, in the relevant program documents. But there is no obligation to attach it. But there is nothing also from preventing member states from attaching it to the programs. There are no rules. I mean, there are pros and cons with this. The only reference we have is the recital in the regulation, and this means also that there is quite a lot of freedom. So this is why we have developed an approach in the pilot, but this is not the Bible. It's really the one way of doing things. But it's formally not part of, for example, the templates, the program templates, which are part of the regulation. So you will see that there is no space to add the roadmap. However, it's good to refer to roadmaps in the, for example, in the part where the program strategy is being described.
So again, I would like to thank you all for being here today and wish you a very good afternoon. My name is Verinia Michalun. I'm with the OECD's Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities. It's a very long name. And I am joined by my colleague, Daniel Gerson from the Public Governance Directorate. We are going to be sharing this presentation in tandem, so you won't have to just hear my voice for the next half hour. I'd also, before we start, just like to thank the European Commission and DG Regio and Ann Kirsten's team for having the opportunity to work on this project with the managing authorities, the 5 pilots, and also IPA for giving us the opportunity to present this project and this training. So basically what we'll do in this first session is take a look at why build administrative capacity. We'll go more in detail into the OECD analytical framework for administrative capacity building, sort of the famous onion that we've been talking about, and then spend some time on the value of administrative capacity building roadmaps. So why build administrative capacity? I'd like to contribute a little bit to what Ann Kirsten said, but with a slightly different perspective as to the why. And part of this has to do with public investment. And that public investment levels have been or remain lower than they were prior to the financial crisis in 2008. They are in a slightly upward trend at all levels of government, but they still haven't reached 2008 levels. And in the EU 28 countries between 2007 and 2017, public investment tended to decline in the majority of countries. That's the graph on the right, and we see that on all the bars going to the left. We don't know what the impact will be with COVID. COVID could lead to decreases, again, in public investment, as we saw in 2008, or it could lead to increases. So, for example, with the cohesion policy funds, with the recovery and resilience fund, with the just transition fund. That's still left to be seen. But while we know that public investment levels are lower than they were in 2009, we also know that there is a rising need for public investment and for efficient and effective management of public investment, because basically, there's an investment gap of about 6.3 trillion US dollars annually for between 2016 and 2030, if we want to meet the demands of sustainable growth and development pre-COVID. And this isn't even taking into consideration addressing climate concerns, which would require an additional $300 billion per year, or European social infrastructure investment needs, which would call for at least between 100 to 150 billion euros per year. So at the same time, we also know that cohesion policy funding is a significant source of investment financing for EU countries. And while the EU average is at about 8.5% as a share of public investment between 2015 and 2017, and this may grow now post-COVID, we also see a great variety in the levels between countries, and it's reaching up to more than 80% in some countries. So given the mismatch in how much public investment is needed and how much public investment is happening, and the significant levels of EU financing, what it leads to is this very clear awareness of the importance of governance and administration of public investment funds, and making the most of what you have and the most of what is possible to access. And we know that quality governance matters for public investment. It can help generate savings, and it can also help minimize potential losses from inefficient investment. But there are challenges, and among these challenges are managing excessive administrative procedures, dealing with the impact of a lack of a long-term strategy, a lack of strategic planning capacity, a lack of ability to design projects, and potentially insufficient or out-of-date data. So these are all challenges in the governance of investment administration and management. Administrative capacity also matters, and it matters for planning and implementing cohesion funds because good coordination is important. So is low staff turnover, sufficient skills, institutional stability. All of this together results in more effective planning and implementation. And when we talk about building administrative capacity, we're really talking about developing skills and experience and building capacity in technical and management and strategic thinking. It's a learning by doing process. And it's important that capacity building activities and technical assistance are differentiated and targeted. It's also important that senior leadership is on board and engaged and becomes a champion for change. So why administrative capacity building? Why these roadmaps? Ultimately, because quality governance and administration matters for public investment. And that's what these roadmaps are all about. They're about helping managing authorities build their administrative capacity for even better governance and investment management by the managing authority itself. So with that, we will move into the OECD analytical framework for administrative capacity building. And with this, I will turn the presentation over to Daniel.
Thank you, Verinia, who will be coming back in a moment, so don't worry. You're not stuck with me for too long, but my name is Daniel Gerson. I work at the OECD in a different area than Verinia, but we've been working very closely on this project together. And I also have to express my thanks to Anne-Kirsten and the team from DG Regio for bringing us together and giving us this excellent opportunity to collaborate within the OECD, with DG Regio, with the 5 participating countries who have been wonderfully open and allowed us to experiment on them in various different ways. And I'm sure you'll hear more about what that felt like from their side tomorrow. So one of the starting points that we really had to think back to is what does administrative capacity building mean? How do we begin to analyze administrative capacity building or administrative capacity, period, particularly from an ESIF perspective, and within the context of an individual managing authority, which was the level that we were working at during the pilot. And what we came up with is a model that I think is quite applicable to any organization, essentially. And it is this diagram that you see on the left of your screen, which recognizes that, of course, people are at the heart of administrative capacity. Administration is nothing but a bunch of people trying to achieve objectives together. And so when we talk about administrative capacity, we have to first think of the people who are working within the administration and how they are supported to do their work, what kinds of skills they bring, and I'll get into that in a little bit more detail. But of course, people don't function in a vacuum. We function within an organizational context, and the tools, the leadership, the organizational complementarities of and the way that organization is established, structured, run, has a huge impact, of course, on the way that the people are able to use the skills and capabilities and knowledge that they have. And that organization sits within a context of strategic planning, coordination, implementation. So this is really how the organization sees its role, the strategy it's trying to implement, the way that it's able to reach out and connect with its immediate environment. And that, of course, puts a big focus on the various different groups, people, organizations, structures that it interacts with. So the beneficiaries on the one hand and the broader stakeholders on the other. And this all happens within a greater context. We can think of these as the enabling framework conditions, the sort of natural rules that guide and dictate all of the ways that organizations are structured and interact with each other. This last group, the enabling framework conditions, is a bit the broader governance structure. It is not usually within the direct control of the institutions that we focused on in this context. So for example, we were looking at MAs and we were looking at people within MAs, but a lot of the tools that that could be accessible to hire, to motivate, to develop people were sometimes much beyond the authority of the MA, right? We're talking about the kinds of employment constraints, the employment policies, the employment rules that are set by authorities that exist far beyond the reach of the authority of the head of the MA. So that's a little bit an example of framework conditions, or rules and legislation around procurement, for example, around budgeting and co-financing. So this is a bit what we wanted to look at, how we wanted to imagine administrative capacity. And we'll go through each of these in a little bit more detail in turn. So starting with people, we tried to do a bit of a mapping of the different kinds of skills, the different kinds of competencies, of jobs within the organizations. And we were looking at all of these different factors essentially in managing authorities, a lot was focused on operations, of course. But it's also incredibly important to look at the corporate skills within the organization. And so that's really looking at the inside part, the operations, often looking at the way that the main elements of the operating programs are being delivered. But it's also incredibly important to look at the policy and analysis functions, which sometimes didn't exist within the core MA. Sometimes those are peripheral to the MA. The people who are setting up the investment strategies, the people who are working on actually designing the operational programs. And Of course, a big and often forgotten skill set is around stakeholder management, because MAs are working with a huge amount of stakeholders, and there is a lot of energy that is or should be usually invested in this area. And then of course the leadership and management. And when we talk about these kinds of people, if you can go to the next slide, Verinia, there's a very simple framework that I really like that helps to think about what people need within an organization to be able to perform well. And regardless of which category that person comes from, there are 3 ingredients to performance. They need to have the right abilities and skills. So they have to have, you know, the appropriate criteria, qualifications, and this puts sort of an image, a focus on processes that exist for attraction, recruitment, selection, and development. But having a lot of good people in an organization with the right skills doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to perform well. They also obviously need to want to perform well. And so we need to ensure that they're people who are motivated by the right values, who are motivated by the right incentives, and who are able to, so we're talking about intrinsic motivation, we're talking about extrinsic motivation, and then we're looking at performance systems. We're looking at appraisal systems, rewards and compensation. And that may not be enough. They also need an opportunity to perform. They need to be able to actually take their abilities and their motivations and apply them to exciting work. And that is really a leadership and management challenge, and takes us inside the organization, allows us to look at how does the organization actually structure itself to enable people to use their abilities, skills, and motivations effectively. So the second dimension of the organizational structure that the model that we showed you is around the organization itself. And so this is, in this case, we are really looking within the MA itself. You know, what is the strategy that the MA is trying to achieve? This was usually designed within its operational program. So there's usually a fairly clear understanding of the objectives and the way that this is being operationalized. And then the question is, how does the organization align these objectives through its governance and leadership processes? Are there the right governance structures? Is there the right relationship amongst the heads of the various different units, opportunities for them to share, collaborate, organize their decision-making collectively? How is this communicated down through the organization, through the managing authority itself? Looking at the various different processes, systems, structures, and tools that the organization uses to communicate these objectives, but also to support its people in achieving these objectives through KPIs, for example, through policies and strategies that are adapted based on monitoring, through the core functions, the HR, the IT, the finance, et cetera, et cetera. Are these actually able to align to the right kinds of objectives and support people in achieving those? This all is somewhat abstract at this stage, right? But when it's applied within the managing authority, it helps really to look at the various different things that might actually be standing in the way of the people, their motivations and skills, and achieving the objectives that the strategy outlines. Now I'll pass it back to Verinia for the next elements of the onion.
Thanks, Daniel. So the third dimension of the third layer of this onion has to do with the strategic planning, coordination, and implementation. And here, when we're talking about strategic planning, and it's really the planning of the program and its execution. And there are 4 main aspects that we would look at. One is the MA's, does it take a strategic approach to its planning and programming and priority setting? And within this, is it really working, or is it able to ensure coherence and links with national and sector frameworks, or is it sort of operating in its own vacuum? Is it making sure that its priorities and what it's seeking to achieve also are reflecting national and regional development needs? Is it capturing complementarities across priority axes? One of the things that we noticed working with EMAs is that often work in one priority axis could also support meeting objectives of another priority axis. And so are there projects, is there thinking about how to link these objectives so that investment can be made and managed in such a way that objectives in two areas are being met? And also supporting cross-jurisdictional cooperation. And this is particularly important for SUD and ITI. Is the managing authority able to help subnational government beneficiaries work together in designing and implementing? The second point is optimizing coordination and communication for program design and implementation. So is there a toolkit of hard and soft coordination mechanisms throughout the system? And by hard coordination, very hard is sort of binding agreements. Soft can be dialogue bodies or dialogue mechanisms. And then you have an entire spectrum in between. Is there effective coordination with authorities at different levels of government, with the national level, with the regional level, with the local level when it's appropriate? And are exchange opportunities optimized? And by this, it's exchange with other MAs within your own country and learning from each other, or exchange with MAs from other countries, as Anne-Kirsten mentioned with the peer-to-peer exchange. But also exchange with the European Commission. And one of the things that came up in our study was how much managing authorities really valued being able to exchange with the Commission and the importance of a timely sharing of knowledge. The next part of strategic planning and coordination implementation is building a more strategic program implementation process. And by this, we mean making sure that project calls and selection processes are really well aligned with beneficiary capacity, because while it seems obvious, it's often not. And that doesn't help in terms of absorption, for example. Our calls and selection criteria designed and implemented in a way that they support innovative projects. One of the obstacles to this is, and logically so, a very large fear of corrections. And the validation and control systems, which we'll come to in the next slide. And that can inhibit managing authorities from designing calls or accepting projects that may be more innovative. They tend to opt for what's safe, and that can affect meeting innovation objectives and building a more innovative MA and beneficiaries. Finally, also the need to minimize the need to carry projects forward into another programming period, but that's a little bit more challenging. And the last point is expanding performance measurement practices. And this is an important point, and it was something that we found managing authorities had a bit of a hard time grappling with, because there's a lot of performance measurement that goes on with cohesion policy funds. But what we mean by this is not just measuring the performance of the OP with respect to the projects it's implementing or the program itself, but what is the impact of the OP on larger objectives, on larger development objectives for a region or for the country. And that's a bit harder, but it's just as important. Within this also, there are issues of ensuring effective data collection for the OP itself, which isn't always that easy to do. Using evidence bases to adjust the program when it's possible and to support implementation. And also to optimize the value of the monitoring committee. What we saw was that the monitoring committee concept is a very good concept, but it's not always optimized. So that's the third dimension of the onion. And from this, we move out to, to beneficiaries and stakeholders. And really, beneficiaries are fundamental, because without the beneficiaries, there's really no program and there's no investment. So it's very important to build beneficiary capacity, to provide tailored and quality support, to communicate with beneficiaries regularly, and to promote ongoing information exchange. It's also important to partner with beneficiaries. And I know this sounds like, oh yeah, of course, but it doesn't always happen easily. And beneficiaries can often feel, from what we heard speaking with them, that their blame is shifted on them if something doesn't work. And I think it's there seems to often be a them and us dynamic between MAs and beneficiaries, whereas really it should be an us and us dynamic, where beneficiaries are considered equal partners in cohesion policy funding. And so with this, it's very important to partner with beneficiaries, but also beneficiary support organizations, such as the consultants that they tend to consult, or professional or business associations and subnational government associations. It's also important to engage a broad range of external stakeholders. So understanding their needs, building their capacity, incorporating them into planning processes, obtaining stakeholder input, and considering the possibility of involving private actors. Now, I just want to take a moment to give some brief delineation. Internal stakeholders, when we refer to those, we refer to the MA, to the certifying authority and the accounting function, the audit authority, IBs, national coordinating bodies, sort of the management and control system actors. External stakeholders are beneficiaries, those who support beneficiaries, but also the national authorities, subnational authorities, private sector, professional, civil society organizations, academia, etc. And the final dimension is the systemic framework condition dimension, which is what Daniel was mentioning. And this is more difficult because, as Daniel was saying, the systemic framework conditions are the parameters in which managing authorities operate. And they may or may not be able to change anything in their framework conditions. And they may or may not be able to influence their framework conditions. But the framework conditions carry a lot of weight. And within the framework conditions, we think about the management and control system. So is the management and control system flexible, adaptable, and responsive? Is administrative burden high? And what can the managing authority do? We also consider regulatory and other frameworks. So within this, questions to ask are regulations clear? Are they understandable? And are they stable over time? Is there an uneven application of regulatory instruments, and are regulatory barriers impeding the easy use of funds? Are national regulations more stringent than European Commission regulations? Is there regulatory incoherence? And other frameworks such as state aid or ITIs, are those clear and are they adapted to the MA's context or to the country's context? Procurement processes were a very large framework condition creature. And here the question is procurement legislation clear? Is it clear to the MA? Is it clear to the beneficiaries? And is it clear to everyone in between? Is there formal guidance for procurement processes? And is that clearly and well communicated? Is there a procurement unit that can help? And then the last point that came forward in these framework conditions were the control, verification, and audit systems, which also were a big sort of block in framework conditions. And here the main issue was consistency and certainty, because managing authorities have been finding that the control, verification, and audit interpretations can vary. And that makes it even more difficult for them to function and for the beneficiaries to function. So as you can see, these are hard for the managing authorities themselves to change. So taking a look at the value of administrative capacity building roadmaps and asking what the purpose of a roadmap is. Basically, what the roadmap does is, once the managing authority has decided that, yes, building administrative capacity is a good idea and this is something we need to do, how do we go about it? Well, The roadmap helps prioritize and map out the initiatives for administrative capacity building within an MA. And they help build collective confidence and build buy-in by all of the stakeholders by communicating expectations, but also by bringing everyone into the process. And in this, they also help create a sense of accountability for delivery. And this is something that I think that both the Greek MA and the Croatian MA will be able to speak to very, very eloquently. And finally, they help to test what's working for administrative capacity and what isn't, and then be able to adjust the process. There's some common components of roadmaps. And these include, well, before I get into the common components, it's important that roadmaps be flexible and creative, but they should share some components. And among these are a preamble, explaining the reason for the roadmap and providing some context. What we found is that it's actually really helpful to structure roadmaps in pillars, and generally these pillars were the different layers of the onion. And here in each pillar, there are concrete projects or initiatives that can show the high-level priorities for administrative capacity building within the managing authority. And they should also highlight the outcomes. In each pillar, there are a series of projects, and these are the actions, and they're designed to tackle the challenges that were identified. And we'll go into this in the process stage later. But these projects need to have a champion, and ideally and also identify implementing stakeholders. They also need to be very realistic. Periodicity is important too, and it can vary, but it's critical to highlight how long an action may take, because that helps manage expectations and also helps manage resources. There are some optional features to a roadmap, such as estimated resources, predefined KPIs. They could be made public. They could be living documents. We tend to think that they are. And you could narrow the periods into months, quarters, or other horizons if that is something that your MA would want to do. And now I turn this back over to Daniel, so that you don't get too tired of either one of us, to discuss some guiding principles.
We tag teamed this, but we only have a couple slides left for this first presentation. We've thrown a lot of theory at you so far, and in the second presentation, we're going to make it much more concrete by walking you sort of through the process that we use to develop these. And I think, you know, one of the guiding principles that perhaps isn't on the slide, but is that the process is as important as the roadmap. But it's not difficult. It's not rocket science. The theory that we've shared with you is really more of just a set of questions that need to be asked and that generate interesting responses. The philosophy that we've taken to developing these roadmaps is generally that the people who are working in the management and control system, the people who are working in your MA and around your MA and with your MA, probably have a better sense of the administrative capacity, strengths, and challenges than any expert from outside the MA will ever have. And they're going to be the ones who are able to probably come up with the solutions that may not be the most innovative, flashy, fancy, transformational ideas, but the solutions that will actually work, because they come from people who know how the system works and what's wrong with it and what would actually work within there. And so this helps to, you know, demystify the whole thing a little bit and to try and remember that this is about being clear, being concrete, being easy to understand, because you're engaging a really broad range of people who will have been part of the process from the start. These roadmaps then therefore are also to be shared. They're alive. You don't have to get it all right the first time. In fact, you probably won't. You'll probably have a bunch of ideas that you put down the first time and that over a year you realize maybe not as implementable as you thought. Things change, priorities shift, pandemics happen. You know, there's so many uncontrolled uncertainties out there. And so it's a living document. It's meant to be looked at again, to be revised, to be updated, to be changed as it goes. This is not a compliance exercise. So whatever you put in there isn't a question of, you know, did you do it, yes or no? Was it, you know, show us the proof and get your reward. It's meant to be an engagement tool and a way of generating ideas that can address the various different issues that Verinia and I, Rose, brought forward in the previous section of this presentation. In that sense, it needs to be relatively streamlined. It shouldn't be an incredibly complicated document. You need to prioritize the kinds of issues that you want to work on and frame those over periods, because, you know, at least in the MAs that we're working with, no, this isn't anybody's full-time job. And so you have to be realistic about how many projects can really be done and completed effectively. And that means that there also has to be a level of accountability over the process, right from the start of the process, from right now when you start thinking about the process, right to the development of the roadmap and then the implementation of it. How is that roadmap going to be embedded in the management culture, the leadership culture of the organization? And how are people going to monitor its development and take responsibility and ownership over it changing over time? So the final slide that we have to share for you before we stop and open this up to discussion is just a little example of what a roadmap could look like. Again, it's really quite simple. And this is how we established ours when we did it with the 5 managing authorities. But again, as Kirsten said at the start, there are no rules. Yours could look very different from this. But we began looking at the different goals and sub-goals aligned to different aspects of the onion. So essentially the challenge area 1, we grouped together the people organizational because there's a lot of interaction. And this was really everything inside the managing authority. And then we grouped together the strategic planning and the strategic planning elements. And then you have a challenge area on beneficiaries and stakeholders. And for each of these, we broke it down into specific goals that was based on the diagnostic exercise that we'll talk about more in detail in the next section. So what was the challenge that an action is trying to resolve? What actions did the MA prioritize to resolve those under the action column? Who is responsible for overseeing the implementation of this action? Who are the implementing stakeholders? So the different people that need to be also involved in implementing this. What's the general timing approach? And then, you know, are there specific deliverables and milestones that can be broken down? It's a basic action planning template. So we're not going to show you how to create something that is incredibly detailed and technical. It's really not a technical exercise. And I think that's part of the beauty of this process, because most of the MAs that we've worked with in the past have a wealth of various different reports that have been done by technical external experts that have done all sorts of diagnosis of X, Y, and Z. And yet they still don't manage to always implement them to the degree that they want. So this is really a different way of approaching it, coming from the inside, building on that knowledge that's been created in the past through different consulting groups and other things, other processes that you might have undertaken, but really trying to embed it inside the MA. And owning this as an organization together. So on that point, we'll stop here and open it up for discussion. I think we're exactly on time according to our agenda. So I think actually, Verinia, you're starting off this one again.
That's true, sorry. So welcome back. Also, I hope everyone had a good coffee or tea or chocolate. We spent some time talking about the concept behind administrative capacity building roadmaps. And so now what we're going to do is look at the process and how it actually works. So Daniel, if we can go to the next slide. And the process is actually quite sequential for the most part, and has about 4 different steps. One is the first one about information gathering and taking stock. We'll go through this in detail, but different ways to gather information about the MA. Moving into an administrative capacity building workshop and what that entails. And in a sense, that's what our breakout groups will be simulating. Developing administrative capacity building actions. And we'll have an opportunity to give that some consideration also in the workout groups after this presentation. And finally, at the end is bringing it all together. So those are in developing administrative capacity building roadmaps and actions from the OECD pathway, it's those 4 main steps. So if we go to the next slide. So what we'll first do is focus on gathering information and taking stock. And we're back to the onion, it comes up a lot. And there are different types of information to gather. So when we think about the people dimension of administrative capacity building, some of the information that can be gathered that's helpful for the MA to consider are things such as the general employment framework, the processes behind recruitment and promotion, what pay systems and incentive systems look like, whether or not, hi, thank you. Whether or not training possibilities are available, but not only are training possibilities available, but do people take those training possibilities? And do they take that opportunity? And if they do, terrific. If they do not, why? So these are the kinds of things to explore, for example, with people. And there may be a whole bunch of other ones, but these are the ones that we thought we'd bring up. When it comes to the organization, its structure, what the lines of responsibility are, what are the internal communication practices? How do different units of the MA talk to each other? And within the management and control system as well. What happens with leadership? Where is leadership positioned in this dynamic? With respect to strategic planning and coordination and implementation, some of the type of information to look at is who does the MA work with closely, and how does it work with these entities in order to implement the program? What are some of the coordination mechanisms used? We talked about that before. Are they effective? And do stakeholders think they're effective? Also, that's that broad perspective that becomes really important. Plus the performance monitoring and evaluation. Does it work? Is it used? Do people resist it? Is there enough information? With beneficiaries and stakeholders, it's important to try to gather information on how involved are beneficiaries and other external stakeholders in the program design process. Not very involved, is that because they're not interested, or is it because the MA doesn't give them enough opportunity, or it's not properly timed? Are there training and support programs for beneficiaries? Okay, good, yes, they're in place, but are they effective? Are they actually what the beneficiaries really are expecting or needing to know? And finally, how is communication undertaken with external stakeholders? With what frequency, with what effectiveness? Framework conditions are the other type of information to gather in terms of those external challenges and the potential risks that these challenges pose to program implementation and management. You can go to the next slide. So this is a lot of different types of information to gather. And in the process that we worked on with the pilot MAs, we found that there were at least 4 different broad sources for the information. And some of this is contained already in the MA, and it's kind of sort of an information investigative process on the part of the MA, which includes strategic or operational planning documents that are already there, or organizational charts, or training catalogs or training program information, decision-making protocols, other data, other data information such as HR information or beneficiary information. It's all kind of floating around and it needs to be gathered and thought through. Excuse me. Another way to gather information is to develop a very short targeted questionnaire that's circulated within the MA and the MCS, and also potentially to external stakeholders for their own insight and perspectives on what some of the administrative capacity challenges are of the managing authority. And I really want to stress that. Then there's the next source is bringing people together a little bit, as I believe Portugal, excuse me, was mentioning, and having sort of focus groups or roundtable discussions with a diversity of actors, including representatives from the managing authority at the technical and leadership levels, from IBs, from the national coordination body and external stakeholders, to get their perspectives also on what you have found from the initial information gathering, because you gather the information, but it also has to be digested and capacity issues bubbling up. And finally, another source is the OECD's Administrative Capacity Building Self-Assessment Instrument, which was developed thanks to our work with the managing authorities, for managing authorities to gain additional insight as to where some of their administrative capacity gaps might be. So it's part of the information gathering process. This instrument is really to help MAs identify and prioritize their capacity gaps, to develop administrative capacity building actions based on these gaps, and to facilitate auto-evaluation over time. But it's also quite adaptable to different types of authorities. So for example, the higher level bodies, the management control system, or the national coordination body. We can go to the next slide. And now we move on to the workshop. Daniel.
So I'll talk a little bit about the workshop, which was sort of the cornerstone of the data collection and roadmap development exercise that we conducted in 5 of the managing authorities. But perhaps just a bit of background to this, what we did when we came to each of the countries, we did elements of everything that Verinia has just talked about. So we started with a data collection exercise. We were in Paris, the managing authorities were in their own countries. We asked them a lot of questions about the kinds of information that they could gather and share with us ahead of time. We then came to the countries and spent a couple days in back-to-back meetings with a whole range of different stakeholders. We talked to different units within the managing authority. We talked to the heads of the managing authority. We had special meetings with the IBs if there were particularly core to the operations. We had special meetings with key beneficiaries. We had special meetings with the National Coordination Authority. And in all of these, we had just asked them, you know, their perspectives, their questions. We asked them basic questions about how they understood the administrative strengths and challenges of the managing authority and where they thought these came from and what their experience was working in it or with it. And this allowed us to prepare the workshop, which essentially brought all of those people and even a few others into one room together. So up to now, we had just been sort of seeing them separately. It was a bit of a revolving door coming in and out of a room that we were sitting in, and we were getting sort of separate snapshots of different perspectives of the issue from many different angles. And then the workshop happens where everybody comes together, the whole sort of 40 people around the table. Yeah, it was usually around 40 or 50 people, depending on the managing authority and the size of the work that they were doing and the community that they worked with. And that workshop was, you know, really a moment to build common understanding across all of the actors in this complicated system. It was an opportunity to share ideas on ways that administrative capacity could be boosted. I mean, first on what the actual issues were, what were the underlying issues, and how could they be addressed. As I said, there was a broad group of participants, representatives from across the management and control system, from every area of the managing authority, at least one, often many, sitting in the room with us, and beneficiaries, IBs, et cetera, and it took a whole day. It was one entire day where in the morning, we really did a diagnostic exercise, a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, or sort of an adapted SWOT analysis. And in the afternoon, we worked on generating solutions. This might sound complicated, but it was actually really simple. And I will show you the steps that we took to do this. First, how did we set this up? So I think in all of the ones that we did, we had 5 tables because around 40 people, so that means around 8 people per table. It's about the right size of people that you can have for really generating an interactive exchange. And each table had a different theme, a different part of that onion. And there was some variation in each of these because sometimes there were particular issues that were really coming up a lot in the original interviews that we had done. So we made a special table around those, or, so that there's different ways that this can be organized. And again, it's really meant to be molded to the context of your management and control system and to your managing authority. And at the table there's one facilitator per table. And that facilitator did not come from the OECD team. They came from the managing authority, or at least from an organization within the realm of the managing authority, if it wasn't the managing authority itself. And each of these facilitators were generally neutral people, right? It was not the head of the managing authority. That's not going to get you what you need in this situation. It's somebody who can be a good facilitator, who can bring out ideas, who can create a sense of safe engagement, because people need to be honest, clear, open. It's somebody who should understand a bit the business of the managing authority, so it's good if they come from inside it, but who's not going to be dominating the discussions of the group. And it's somebody who's well prepared. We sat down with all of the facilitators before, the day before, 2 days before. We had a list of instructions that were prepared. So they really understood what it was that they were going to do. And these happened in the local language, the conversations at the table. Who else is at the table? Not necessarily who you would expect. In fact, we really tried to sort of shake up the representatives at each of these tables and have a bit of a random sample. I mean, not a real random sample, but we tried to make sure, for example, at the people table, that it wasn't just HR people, for example. If there were 5 HR people, we split them up and put them to 5 different tables. We tried to make sure that each table had a good representation of different aspects of the managing authority sitting at it, and even beneficiaries at the people strategy table. Why not? They had interesting ideas, surprising ones sometimes, that were really able to shake up the kind of groupthink or usual sort of suspects that normally happen in these kinds of situations. And this took a little bit of organization. In some cases, we actually, the people organizing, from the managing authority really sat down and created like a seating arrangement, almost like a wedding. In other cases, it happened a little bit more naturally. There is some things to watch out for. For example, when people come in the room and sit down, they don't usually look at which table they sat down in, and sometimes they just don't feel like changing. Sometimes you have to actually get people to stand up and move them around to make sure that they're sitting at different tables. They often like to sit at the beginning having coffee with their friends. And then when you start, they're sitting with their friends, which are all their colleagues, and that's what we don't want. So the idea is really at some point you have to find a way to get them to split up. And then what happens? Well, we started with an introduction, of course, and we did one exercise in the morning and one exercise after lunch. The morning exercise was really focused on diagnosing the administrative capacity building strengths and challenges. And so each group, each table went through this very simple exercise. We asked them to discuss the strengths of this area within the managing authority. Start with the positive. And the area, when I say this area, I mean the theme of the table. So what were the strengths of the people working in the managing authority? What are the strengths of the organization, how the organization is set up, right? We've talked about these already. We won't go back through them, but what are the strengths of the strategy or et cetera, et cetera. And then what are the opportunities that these present to build on? And then after really having a positive discussion, move to the challenges, the weaknesses. What are the weaknesses and challenges currently facing this area? What are the root causes? What do we really think is underlying these challenges? Why are they so intractable and hard to address? And who could actually help to address them? Are they in the room? Have we been able to include them? In other words, if we're talking about the people strategy, it wasn't enough just to try and engage people from the HR department of the managing authority. Really tried to bring people from that central authority of that designs the human resource policies for the entire civil service, tried to make sure that they were also present for this activity. And then by the end of this process, we asked everybody to come up with the top 3 priority problems that they think could be addressed in this roadmap. And so essentially, we went through this arc. What are we good at? What are we doing well? And what are the strengths that we can build on? What problems are we facing? And what are the top 3 burning issues that we think could be addressed in the context of this exercise? And then there was plenary. Everybody would share what they were working on. They would walk us through what they had done. Big open discussion, lots of debate, lots of discussion, different people. Because we had split everybody up around the room, a lot of people had a lot to add to other tables. And so this created a very interesting dynamic and lots of exchange after each presentation at the table. Some stuff would get adjusted, some stuff would get added. And by the end, before lunch, we had 3 main priority problems for each table and some interesting insight into what the underlying issues are. Remember that we haven't brought in a great detailed expert analysis into this. It's really, 90% of the information that was being shared and used to develop these ideas is just coming from the people in the room, from the people who work in the managing authority and those who work around the managing authority. After lunch, we did an exercise really developing solutions. So in this case, we asked them, pick one of the challenges from the top 3 you've identified in the morning. And by the way, everybody's still sitting at the same table that they started in. Nobody's moved. So if you worked on people in the morning, you're working on people in the afternoon. Pick one challenge from the top 3 and then just begin brainstorming. What solutions would help to address this issue? What have you seen happening in other areas that you've worked in the past? If there are people from other organizations at the table, what have you seen work in your organizations? There was a lot of very interesting creative ideas coming out. And many people from the beneficiaries, for example, had very interesting ideas to add to these sessions as well. Who would be then the main actors that would have to lead or contribute to the solutions that you're starting to identify? And what would be the initial steps, the first things that would have to happen to begin developing these particular solutions? That allowed us to really start saying, okay, let's try and take something that might seem very big and complex at the beginning and just break it down into those first really concrete initial steps. And then if you work through this process for 1, move on, because you've identified 3, so move on to the second and the third. We gave, I think, most of the tables around an hour and a half to do this. And many of them really got so into it, they got so in depth that they often didn't get much past the first one, sometimes into the second one. It really generated a lot of exciting, creative energy. Many of the people in the room told us afterwards that even though this is a very simple way of working, this was often the first time that they had worked this way within their managing authority. Again, at the end, we asked each table to provide us feedback on the solutions identified, and then we opened it up to another quite animated discussion around the solutions, getting feedback from everybody in the room after each table sort of pitched their solutions to each other. So this is not rocket science. This doesn't require a PhD in facilitation or in management, or, you know, this is something that really anybody can do, and it's a process that is it's effective because it's simple, because it's accessible. It's as accessible to one of the secretaries for in the senior manager's office as it is for one of the experts working on specifically on the management and control system. So and everybody sits there and works as equals in this room, right? There's no more hierarchy when people are sitting and working at the tables. All ideas are valued, and it's really important to be able to set that context from the start. I'm going to pass it back to Verinia now, who can talk about the next steps of the process.
Thanks, Daniel. So just before I talk about the next steps, there are 2 points that I want to bring up about the workshop, and they're just details. One is, not only did each table have a facilitator, but at the table, someone was designated a scribe. So there was someone there to take notes. And in fact, each table had not a whiteboard, but the big white sheets, so that the strengths, opportunities, challenges, and weaknesses could be captured in the moment on those sheets, as well as highlighting what the priority actions were and the different action thoughts. So it's very important to capture that in the moment, and the facilitator can't really do that very easily. So someone at the table has to also be named the scribe. So once the workshop sort of concluded, it moves into, well, now what do we do with this information? And what we do with this information is use it to build on the initial thinking of actions that were identified in the workshop. So there are sort of 3, just kind of as part of this, you can use the information from the workshops. You can also use information from having run the EU competency framework for management and implementation of ERDF. Joanna, I'll answer your question in just a moment. You can use the roadmaps for administrative capacity building, the toolkit. You can also use the self-assessment instrument. All of that helps feed developing actions, the information captured in there. Joanna, with respect to your question, the people that were at the tables were a very wide range of individuals, from people within the managing authority to external stakeholders, and representatives of intermediate bodies, beneficiaries, up and down the hierarchy of each of these. And the tables were populated not by professional function. They were populated by having been distributed. But we didn't want, at the people table, only HR people, or at the strategy table, only people working on strategy, for example. I hope that answered the question. So in terms of developing the roadmap and the actions, just overall, MAs need to really prioritize what's realistic and hold discussions with the stakeholders, internal and external. And then they go back to reprioritize. It's very much of an iterative process over time. The next slide. And again, this comes back to what we were talking about earlier. Once those initial thoughts about actions are captured, and the team that is working on this in the managing authority go back home, go back to their offices, they need to start thinking through these actions in terms of what it is that they can realistically implement and how to gain, how to maximize effectiveness, which also means making sure that actions are mutually reinforcing, that putting in place one action can also help support other actions, either within that particular pillar, such as people, or maybe putting in place an action that has to do with people also helps reinforce capacity building in the organization or in the strategy dimension, for example. It's also important to spread actions temporally. So spread them over the short, medium, and long term. And there are a number of reasons for this. One is resources and making sure that you don't sort of bunch up all your resources at once. But also it's important to achieve quick wins followed by more sustainable gains. It's important to show that the process is giving something. And it's also important for the people working on administrative capacity building within the MA to feel like their time and their effort is accomplishing something. So there's a psychology behind it too. Again, we mentioned this a little bit earlier. Once the actions are developed, and also in the action development process, it's important to think about where they fit within the administrative capacity pillars, that the actions are associated with concrete activity or concrete projects. So how do you transform what could be a solution into specific actions that can be accomplished to meet that solution, to realize that solution? A responsible body needs to be identified. Timing should be identified. The resources, the deliverables, the milestones, those are good to keep in mind. It would be ideal to identify them as well. And again, there's some very clear success factors. Concrete, clear, plain language in terms of how actions are described, because if this is a living document, and if it is used over time, multiple different people need to be able to come back to it and understand it. So shorthand and internal cultural language sometimes isn't always that helpful. Quality over quantity. Too many actions may not be helpful. It's important that the actions be really targeted and high quality and realistic. This other point that actions should be able to be completed by the MA itself is also important, because it's the MA that's embarking on the administrative capacity building. It's not the IBs, it's not the beneficiaries, and it's not necessarily people within the national coordinating body or the senior civil service somewhere else. The MA needs to be responsible for the actions as well. And that doesn't mean that it's only they who implement the actions, but they have to be able to complete them. And again, actions are focused on the MA's capacity. They're not focused on the IBs or on the beneficiaries. That's a different story. But part of MA capacity building can be to support beneficiary capacity building as well. The output should be shared with the relevant actors, and this is important to build ownership and buy-in, or vice versa, buy-in and ownership. The output can also be made publicly available, for example, on an MA's website, if the MA wishes and feels it's relevant. In the next slide, yeah.
So once you have your roadmap with all of the actions based on all of these elements, it's important that there be another opportunity to re-engage the broad community that has been contributing to it, for two reasons. One is to validate the information and make sure that people agree with the way that you have used the ideas and information that they've come forward with. And the other reason is to show them how that the effort that they put into this is actually turned into something and is going to become something. And then, of course, there's the question about turning it into actual actions that are being implemented. So we won't spend too much time on this, but it's, just some ideas. Once the MA has completed its administrative capacity building roadmap, reconvene the same stakeholders who participated in the workshop to validate the work. I mean, this might be a slightly smaller sample of stakeholders, but people who represent the same groups at least. It could be done in multiple groups, but it's really important that they have an opportunity to see what is still a draft, provide some comments and feedback on it, perhaps adjust a few elements to make sure that they are actually viable, feasible, and meeting the actual needs that they tried to articulate earlier. Sometimes people's realization, even just after they have articulated it, their understanding of the situation evolves. And so this is another chance to catch some of those issues as well. It also builds greater buy-in and support for the actions, because all of these actions generally require a bit of a collaborative effort to implement. And so when the roadmap is finalized, the MAs can also then share it publicly or with the staff through the MA, with ministries, with IBs, with beneficiaries. This is part of the accountability process. This is part of saying, here it is, we're really proud of this, and now we're moving towards the implementation phase. And it's important that everybody sees it and understands that this is something that they can contribute to in one way or another. And of course, as we said earlier, this should be an evergreen document so they can regularly update their progress in implementing its capacity building actions, and they can update the actions themselves. They can change the actions if they realize that the environment changes, because it always does. And then there's the actual implementation process. And here I think that you'll get some concrete impressions from Kostas and from Marina tomorrow on how the Greek and Croatian MAs have gone about implementing some of their actions. It's important to shift to this phase to again engage, develop some clear structures and teams that are responsible for implementing these, that are going to be their champions. Some of the examples that we've seen are really mobilizing staff and expertise from across the MA and special project teams to develop these actions, to implement them. Of course, developing action plans. So the roadmap itself is a pretty blunt tool for specific action planning. So you may need to have sort of sub-action plans once the roadmap is agreed to. Think of it as a higher level sort of strategic document. And then ensuring regular communication and interaction, of course, amongst the implementing teams, and tracking and summarizing lessons learned. And there's a lot of lessons learned. I mean, the more that you work on administrative capacity building, the more that you learn about it. And so it is really important to have these moments of reflection where you look back and say, what have we been able to get traction on? What has not worked so well? How do we then need to adjust perhaps some of the other actions in our roadmap so that we make sure that they do work more effectively? So that's the main parts of this presentation. And I hope that this has made it much more concrete and hands-on.